Hello guys, epiczalad here, and today I'm going to be doing a top 15 facts of Final Fantasy through the entire story that you probably didn't know. Well, it's more like fun little tidbits than actual facts. I mean, I guess you could be like, it's facts! But it's more tidbit-y than facts, but you know, because my last one, I did Pokemon, that was pretty good, except not very many people comment. I think there's one that's like, cookies! And I'm like, okay, I'll do cookies. But yeah, I won't do cookies yet. I'm going to do that after, when I can find information. So, sit back, relax, and have your mind filled with information that you'll never be able to use in real life. Trollol. Okay, we'll start this off for fact one. Final Fantasy was an utterly broken mesh of a game. The first one, well, in short, really broken, but I will tell you the entire paragraph that I have. The original Final Fantasy was a revelation back when it hit the US. In the summer of 1990, it was a huge and complex open-ended yet story-driven featured-cooled enemy graphics. And players who made it to the ending were treated to a crazy, mind-blowing time travel plot twist of awesomeness. But Final Fantasy was also a buggy, glitchy mess. A huge chunk of the game's features didn't even work. These hiccups range from the infamous Peninsula of Power, where inappropriately powerful monsters appear on a few overworld tiles, to more critical issues, entire sets of seemingly critical battle sets never actually being applied into combat calculations. For example, if you ever look back and wonder how you possibly beat Final Fantasy as a kid, you can be even more impressed that you did so when half the game didn't even work the way it was supposed to be. As in, the first Final Fantasy was amazing for its time, but it was really bad. There also was no software updates, so that's why, yeah. Probably be really awesome if they redid Final Fantasy 1 instead of Final Fantasy 10. No, I take that back. Final Fantasy 10 needs to be redone. Final Fantasy 1 really needs to be redone. So yeah, on to the next fact. So yeah, fact 2 is someone named Sid is in every game, and his name may or may not be a pun. Yeah, he is in every game. There's Sid from Final Fantasy 10, and then he's in Final Fantasy 10 too, and then there's a Sid in 7, and then there's a Sid in all of them. If you played Final Fantasy games, you've met a guy named Sid. He's a series mainstay, possibly a reference to a historical figure, El Cid, possibly a pun on the Japanese word of discipline, Shito, which is similar to Shido, the literal reading of his Japanese name. Either way, he's never the exact same guy from the title to title, but he always represents wisdom, science, and knowledge. But wait, you say, there was no Cid in the original Final Fantasy. The first was in Final Fantasy II. True enough, but the Game Boy Advance and the PSP remakes of that game have squeezed him into its backstory as much as the main man responsible for inventing the airship. The unseen Cid is actually a key figure in Disney Final Fantasy. So basically, Sid's like, I'm in every game, bitches! Beat it! Well, different personality, Sid's. We'll just move on to the next one. Fact 3. I'm not even going to cut it because I don't feel like it. The series has a tendency to name its characters for meteorological effects. Like Celsius as in celestial, cloud as in those fluffy white things in the sky, squall as a sudden violent storm, Titus, whichever, as in tide, van as in vent, the French word for wind, lightning as in those flashes of electricity you see during a storm. Do you see the theme here? I hope you do. I just hope. I hope. Now we're going to have a really long one. Number 4. The Secret of Mana and the Virgin story are Final Fantasy side stories. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest actually isn't. Final Fantasy has seen plenty of spin-offs and side stories over the years, and not all of them have been called Final Fantasy. In fact, one of the most popular spin-offs barely has a connection to the Final Fantasy at all. The only hint of Secret Mana's lineage is the way that Moogles appear as a status condition. But it's true, Secret of Mana is a sequel to Final Fantasy Adventures, the US version of Seikendenitsu, whose Japanese subtitle was Final Fantasy Gaiden. Vergent Stories Final Fantasy connections are equally vague. Initially, the only hook appears to be that the story is set in Ivalice, the Final Fantasy land where Final Fantasy Tactics and later Final Fantasy 13 was set. Or 12, sorry. Look a little closer, however, and you'll find items like Agrias, Balm, and Qual relic references to the key characters from Tactics. Meanwhile, one of the first games to be positioned as a Final Fantasy spin-off, Mystic Quest for the Nintendo, had nothing whatsoever in common with the series. It did, however, bear a remarkable resemblance to Final Fantasy Legend 3, which was actually the US name of Sega 3, as in the same series as Sega Frontier. That's because Mystic Quest and Sega 3 were developed by the same people. The more you know. Fact 5. Man, this is gonna be long. Okay. The very first Final Fantasy movie was a sequel to a game that didn't even show up in the US until a year after the movie did. Everyone knows that the theoretical motion picture based on Final Fantasy 2001's The Spirits Within was a box office flop that's caused the series creator Haranu to leave the company as its aspiration of Hollywood success imploded. But that wasn't the first Final Fantasy movie. Way back in 1994, Square greenlit Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals, a direct sequel to Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy IV, when Final Fantasy no, I guess it is 5. Final Fantasy 5. I can't read right on my noodles. I suck. When Final Fantasy 7 became a global blockbuster, Urban Version snatched it up for the US release in 1998 in order to capitalize on the series' newfound popularity. This was much in the confusion of America fans because the game it was based on didn't actually show up in the US until the following year when Square released Final Fantasy Anthology for PlayStation. Oops. So they waited a year? That's no wonder. The 30 things you probably... The original game is very closely inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. This is number 6, by the way. Final Fantasy might as well have called itself Dungeons & Dragons. We filled off the serial numbers editions. It's a class system, and magic spells are practically drawn straight from the tabletop game. Certain monsters were even more blatant rips. The sorcerer was simply a weak sauce version of D&D's Illithid, aka Mind Flare, and I have that card. And the Death Eye was even worse. In the original game, Japanese release, it looks so much like D&D, Iconic Beholders, that Square meekly redesigned it before bringing the game to the US. LOL. Number 7. Only one character has appeared as himself in multiple Final Fantasy core titles. You see Sid in every Final Fantasy, and two guys named Biggs and Wedge show up almost as often. Sometimes Cloud Stripes shows up in a spin-off game, but only one character appears as himself across multiple core that is numbered. Final Fantasy games, Gilgamesh, originally X-Death Lieutenant in Final Fantasy V, Gilgamesh was flung into the extra-dimensional void. This gave him license to pop up in multiple Final Fantasy worlds, where a search for a set of legendary weapons could continue. His first cameo was in Final Fantasy VII, 8, where he could be summoned as an alternate to Odin. Since then, he's appeared in multiple Final Fantasy even having been added into remake of the first and sixth games in the series. And yeah, this isn't just idle speculation. Dissidia confirms that there's just one Gilgamesh spending time in games. No, will also allow the possible that Final Fantasy VI meme Go-Go spans multiple games, as he or she initially appeared as a bonus boss in Final Fantasy V. Those two appearances may or may not be the same character. Okay. Number 8. Matthews from Final Fantasy 11? Yeah, no, 2. Is a cult of favorite villain among Japanese fans. Who is the most popular Final Fantasy villain? Sephiroth. Right. Yeah, probably Sephiroth. But among Japanese gamers, the plucky underdog runner-up is Final Fantasy II's Emperor Matthäus, a villain so ambitious he conquered hell and later heaven. Ugh, scares me. In order to exact revenge on the heroes in Dissidia, he's the man behind the man scheming to usurp both chaos and cosmos in order to rule all reality himself. So Sephiroth is a noob in comparison to him. But Final Fantasy makes you more conversant in classical literature and world culture. Number 9. Final Fantasy makes you smarter. Not only do you learn how to develop strategies, you also expand your knowledge of world, religions, and culture. Take, for instance, Golbez's four friends from Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy. I'm running out of breath. Final Fantasy VI, which are based on the demons called Malbranchi that appeared in Dante's Inferno. This wasn't immediately evident in the original translation of the game, since the likes of Barbrica and Scar, known rendered in English as Vel, Alias, and Million, even adjusted as for localization mishaps, you still shouldn't take this book learning entirely as fact value. Final Fantasy re-editions of the powerful Hindu war god Shiva is inevitably a scantily clad lady who uses ice magic. Okay. Number 10. Final Fantasy has ties to 20th century Japanese literature too. Not only can you learn about classical Western literature by playing Final Fantasy, but more recent Japanese novels too. The samurai class, which first debuted in Final Fantasy V, has a unique skill called coin toss, sometimes called Edge. This is a reference to the popular series of Japanese novels from the 1930s about the policeman in medieval Japan named Sangigata Heiji, who captured criminals by throwing money at them. Final Fantasy isn't the only game to make this reference. Either Konami's Ganbare Goemon, set in the same approximate time as Zangan novels, also lets you chuck money to win. Oh yeah, and if you think you'd heard the name Zangata before, it's probably because manga creator Monkey Punch borrowed the name for the persistent Jin Valjean, like Inspector Zanaga, Lupin 3 novels, a reference instead of to compliment. Whew. Knowledge, it hurts my brain. Number 11. Final Fantasy V has more Edwards per capita than other video games. If you played Final Fantasy V, you're familiar with its so-called spoony bard, Prince Edward of Damacian. However, what you may not realize is that his name in Japan was Gilbert. Presumably, it was changed to Edward so it would fit within the US version's 6-letter name limits. Edward sounds nice and regal, but the problem is that Final Fantasy V already had Five. Already had Prince Edward Gerald of Elbin, better known by the nickname Edge. That's Edward Gerald. See? Good thing Edward of Damacia is a mewling wuss whose frailty has stricken him from the party by the time Edward of Elbin shows up. Okay. I know I botched every name in that sentence, but you know what? I don't care. Fact 12. The reason Crystal Chronicles titles only appear on Nintendo platforms. And that reason is money. Crystal Chronicles was a pretty big deal at the time, making the long-awaited return of Square Nintendo console after this estranglement during the PlayStation era. The Nintendo accomplished this in part by enticing Square to exclusively in exchange for helping subsidize the game's development with a venture called the Q Fund. As a result, all Crystal Chronicle games show up exclusively on Nintendo systems, though whether this is a binding contractual obligation or a mere gentleman agreement is anyone's guess. Okay, Fact 13. Final Fantasy II NES is the only game in the series that doesn't use the standard magic system. Final Fantasy II does a lot of things differently from the rest of the series, but nowhere is the most evident than in its spell system, where other games properly use a tiered suffix system. For example, Cure, Curaga, Cure Raja. Final Fantasy II simply gave you spells and let you power them up through 16 tiers. There is no Curaga, merely Cure level 10. Even Final Fantasy II's most controversial designed element, beating the crap out of your character to make them stronger, carried over into Final Fantasy Tactics, but the magic system, I can't read that. 14. The game for Final Fantasy 11 is only one not illustrated by artist Yokota. Even though it's the 130-bit title he was most involved in. You always know a Final Fantasy game when you see it. Its logo, always set in This all same, all caps serif typeface. Always adorned with a slightly abstract illustration all that ties into the game's plot and themes. Whether it's Final Fantasy IV Simple Dragon, Final Fantasy VII's Dark Meteor, or Final Fantasy X's elaborate image balancing sin and Yuna. The logo is one of the series' most important unifying elements, and they've always been illustrated by the original series artist Yoshitaka Amano, all inexplicably enough, except for Final Fantasy 11, making his lack of involvement undoubtedly strange in this fact of all the three PlayStation Final Fantasy 11s is the only one in which Amino was heavily involved, his work having been squeezed into a footnote by up and comer Ta Yunara Zebja. Final Fantasy 12 and Final Fantasy 13, we have no explanation for this. Yeah, I don't know. And the last one, Final Fantasy 11 had the most useless strategy guide ever made. I'll agree with that. Final Fantasy 11 arrived at the end of the PlayStation era. No, is this 11? Am I reading the numerals right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I am. Final Fantasy 11 arrived at the end of the PlayStation era, and just a few weeks after the PlayStation 2 launched, that put it right in the midst of Square drawing realization that they needed an online strategy. This strategy wouldn't be cemented until 2003. Final Fantasy 11. I still think I'm saying it wrong. But they sure didn't keep Square from making a really terrible effort of incorporating some aspect of online functionality into Final Fantasy 11. Since there was no way to get a PlayStation game online, they settled instead of making the strategy guide dependent on their new Play Online site. Anyone who dropped the cash for a copy of Final Fantasy 11 guide was quickly annoyed to find that the juiciest strategy and secrets weren't actually in the book, and their place was a code that users could plug into the Play Online in order to read the strategies on the internet. As the final screw you, usability Play Online has changed radically since then, and those tips are now here to be found. Meaning FX 11 guide is full of pointers to online information that no longer exists. Brilliant, right, guys? Brilliant. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That was 1 minute per fact. Now I can breathe. Okay, guys. See you next time. Epiczalad out. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it. If not, okay. Bye. Epiczalad out. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, or just leave a comment. I don't care either way. If you leave a comment, I'll be even more happy than a like. But yeah. Bye.